You are disappointment to me. I regretted ever allowing you to live with me.
The cruel woman who worked a poor little girl like a slave until the truth about her birth was exposed. She thought no one was watching, not the neighbors, not the villagers, not even God. But that morning, someone finally saw the truth. She wasn't just strict with the little girl. She worked her like a slave, dragging firewood twice her size, scrubbing floors until her fingers bled, eating last, sleeping last, carrying burdens no child should ever know. And all this cruelty was toward a child she claimed to have rescued. A poor little girl who had no one else in the world. Or so she thought. But fate does not stay quiet forever. The woman didn't know a visitor had arrived early. A man with questions. A man searching for a missing child. A man whose eyes froze when he saw the girl's face. Because that poor little orphan had his mother's eyes, his father's birthmark, his blood. And in one terrifying moment, the woman's world began to crack. As the truth rose like a storm she could no longer run from. Now the question is no longer about the cruelty she hid, but about the identity she tried to bury. Because the child she worked like a slave was the heir she should never have touched. And today, everything she built is about to collapse at her feet. A soft breeze swept through the village as dawn stretched across the sky, but the calm broke the moment a quiet footstep approached the compound gate earlier than usual. The visitor didn't mean to arrive before anyone else. Fate simply pushed him forward. As he stepped inside, his eyes caught a small shadow bending beneath a heavy bundle of firewood, wobbling under a weight no child should touch. The scene froze him mid-stride, tightening something in his chest, because nothing about that moment felt normal or accidental. And before he could process it, the truth began to unfold in front of him. The girl struggled forward, her bare feet pressing into the cold earth as the oversized bundle shifted dangerously on her back. Each step trembled like her body was pleading for mercy, yet no voice rose to defend her. The visitor watched in horror as the bundle nearly toppled her, forcing her knees into the dust. She didn't cry or complain. She simply tried to rise again, as if pain was the only language she understood. Something told him this wasn't the first time. Something darker whispered that this cruelty wasn't meant to be witnessed, and yet he was standing right there. A harsh clang echoed from the kitchen doorway, snapping his attention toward the house. There stood the woman, cold posture, sharp eyes, arms folded like a warden inspecting a prisoner. She didn't shout, but her presence alone pushed the girl into frantic motion, scrambling to lift what her small body clearly couldn't bear. The visitor saw the woman's face twist in irritation, not compassion. Something about her stillness felt threatening, calculated. She turned her head slightly, checking if anyone was watching. She believed the morning was hers to control, but she hadn't seen him yet, hidden behind the hibiscus shrubs. He took a slow step forward, heart pounding harder as the cruel choreography continued. The girl dragged herself upright again, the firewood scraping against her bruised shoulders. Sunlight revealed thin welts on her skin, evidence of a story he didn't yet know but already feared. Her breath came out in small, shaky bursts as she shuffled toward the backyard, each movement showing a painful familiarity, like a routine she had repeated far too many mornings. He wondered how long this had been happening and why no one had ever spoken up. But the woman's next gesture answered that question painfully. With a quiet snap of her fingers, the woman dismissed the girl like a servant who displeased her. The girl flinched, eyes lowered, body shrinking as though she had learned not to occupy too much space. The visitor felt a sickening heaviness settle in his gut. Cruelty, this silent, this practiced, didn't grow overnight. It was shaped by power, polished by secrecy, perfected by someone who believed no witness would ever disrupt her rule. He felt something burning in him, a mix of anger and disbelief, as he realized he had stumbled into a story far bigger than a morning chore. He watched the girl disappear behind the house, her small frame nearly swallowed by the towering firewood. The woman turned away as if she had finished a task, her expression smoothing into the familiar mask villagers praised. Kind caregiver, generous guardian, woman of rare compassion. But the visitor had already seen what lay beneath that mask, and the duality unsettled him. It was clear this house lived on two truths, the one she performed for the world, and the one she inflicted on the child. His arrival had pierced that illusion, and yet he knew the worst was still hidden. As he shifted his weight, a twig snapped beneath his foot, and the woman's head jerked sharply toward the sound. Their eyes met, hers widening for a split second, then narrowing with dangerous recognition. In that brief moment, he saw panic flicker behind her control. She knew he had seen too much. She knew the morning had betrayed her. And as the air thickened between them, he realized something chilling. Whatever story lived in this house, it wasn't finished revealing itself. This was only the first crack, and the truth waiting behind it was far more explosive than he imagined. The girl returned from the backyard with dust on her knees and sweat shining on her forehead, moving with the quiet rhythm of someone who knew that slowing down meant punishment. Her small hands shook as she tried to balance the firewood where the woman wanted it, arranging each piece with fearful precision. Around her, the compound was waking up, birds chirping, distant voices, the smell of frying oil drifting from neighboring houses. Life was happening everywhere, yet she stood at the center of it like a shadow no one claimed. In a village full of families, she belonged to no one. Children passed by the gate on their way to school, their laughter spilling into the air like bright colors she was not allowed to touch. She watched them for half a heartbeat, her eyes following the swing of their backpacks, the neatness of their uniforms, the easy way they walked without fear. Then she quickly looked away, returning to the bucket she was scrubbing as if joy itself was forbidden. They knew her name, but not her story. To them, she was simply the orphan that woman took in, a label that excused their distance and fed their curiosity. Whispers floated through the village whenever her thin figure crossed the road. Some said her parents died in an accident. Others swore she was abandoned at birth. A few hinted that misfortune followed her like a curse, which was why she always walked with her head bowed, as if apologizing for existing. No one asked her what she remembered, what she dreamed about at night, what questions clawed at her tiny heart. It was easier to repeat the story they had built for her than to wonder if it was true. Easier to pity her than to truly see her. Inside the house, her world shrank to tasks and commands. She swept the cement floors until no dust line remained, washed plates until her hands wrinkled like old leaves, and fetched water from the well even when the sun turned the path into fire. There were no toys, no books, no gentle hands braiding her hair. She learned to read the woman's footsteps instead, to measure danger by the sharpness of each step. If the sandals slapped the ground too fast, she braced herself. If they dragged slowly, she knew another complaint was coming, and probably another silent punishment. At night, when the compound went quiet and the woman retired to her room with a full belly and a charged phone, the girl curled up on a thin mat near the kitchen doorway. The cold floor pressed against her bones, and the smell of leftover stew she wasn't allowed to touch hovered above her like a cruel memory. She counted the cracks on the ceiling until sleep finally swallowed her. In that half-dream state, she sometimes imagined a soft voice calling her name, a face she couldn't quite remember, and hands that once held her without expecting anything back. On some evenings, when the sky turned orange and the village softened into calm, she would stand by the back fence and stare at the horizon as if it might answer her biggest question: why was she the one left behind? She didn't know where she came from, only that she arrived one day and never left. The woman reminded her often that she was lucky to be here, that without her, the girl would be on the streets. So the child swallowed her confusion, wore gratitude like a borrowed garment, and convinced herself this must be the best she deserved. Yet beneath all that forced gratitude, something fragile refused to die. It showed up in the way she lingered near mothers who laughed with their children, in the way her eyes softened when she saw fathers lift their kids high into the air. A tiny, Stubborn hope lived in her chest, whispering that somewhere in this wide, loud world, there had been a time when she was wanted. She didn't know that hope was not lying. She didn't know that someone was already searching for her, and that the story they told about her being an orphan was about to break. The woman stepped out of the doorway that morning with the poise of someone who believed the world owed her admiration. Her wrapper was perfectly tied, her hair neatly packed, and her face held that carefully curated smile the village had learned to trust. She waved at a neighbor passing by, speaking in a soft, sweet tone that floated across the compound like perfume. No one watching her would ever guess the sharp commands she barked behind closed doors, or the cold satisfaction she felt when the little girl flinched. Her mask was flawless, polished by years of praise. Whenever guests visited, she played the role of the benevolent guardian, telling charming stories of how she rescued the child and gave her a home when no one else would. People admired her generosity, envied her goodness, and praised her for raising a child who was not her own. She soaked in every compliment, letting it stitch together the image she wanted the village to worship. The girl usually stood behind her during these performances, silent and motionless, a prop in the woman's play. And no one ever thought to ask why the child's eyes looked so hollow. Behind the scenes, her voice lost its softness. The smile dissolved. The tone sharpened like a blade. She moved through the house with a rhythm of authority, each step echoing a warning. A misplaced broom? A cup not washed? A speck of dust on the table? The punishment was immediate, sometimes a slap, sometimes a denied meal, sometimes hours of extra chores. She hid her cruelty behind discipline, telling herself she was training the girl, shaping her into something useful. But what she was truly shaping was fear, a fear that made the child fold into herself like a shrinking shadow. Her jealousy intensified whenever someone praised the girl's beauty. Though still young, the child carried a delicate sweetness that drew attention, especially from older women who saw innocence where the caretaker saw competition. The woman pretended not to care, but her eyes darkened each time someone commented on the girl's bright eyes or gentle spirit. She began giving harsher tasks, carrying heavier loads, scrubbing deeper, waking earlier. It was as if she wanted to dim the girl's light, to crush anything in her that might grow into confidence or joy. She couldn't risk losing the admiration she fed on. To maintain her perfect image, she carefully crafted stories that painted the girl as troublesome. She told neighbors the child was lazy, ungrateful, sometimes even disrespectful. She exaggerated small mistakes into moral failings, adding dramatic flair to make the village sympathize with her struggles. Soon, people viewed the girl through her lens, believing she was lucky to be taken in, believing the woman's firmness was necessary. No one questioned the narrative. No one imagined the quiet horrors happening behind the compound walls. They only saw what the woman allowed them to see, and she allowed them very little. Inside her private thoughts, she justified every cruelty. She believed the universe owed her a reward for all the praise she cultivated. She convinced herself that the girl brought misfortune, that fate had planted the child in her home to test her patience. Sometimes she whispered bitter words into the air when no one was listening, blaming the child's unknown mother for leaving behind such a burden. Her resentment festered like a wound she kept reopening. She despised the girl not because of who she was, but because of who she feared the child might become. But on that morning, when she sensed someone else had seen the truth she worked so hard to bury, her composure wavered. For the first time, a crack appeared in her performance. Her eyes darted around the compound, searching for reassurance that her mask was still intact. But masks only hide the face, they do not change the eyes. And her eyes betrayed a tremor of fear, a fear that someone had finally glimpsed the cruelty beneath her sweetness. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, though she didn't yet know how close her downfall truly was. The sun climbed higher as the girl knelt beside a rusted basin, scrubbing clothes with a force that didn't match her fragile arms. Each stroke sent soapy water splashing across the cement, soaking her skirt and chilling her skin, but she didn't dare pause. The bar of soap slipped from her fingers twice, and each time she flinched, as if expecting a blow. Her breath came out in shaky bursts, her wrists trembling beneath the weight of her chores. Childhood shouldn't have felt like a battlefield, yet every movement she made carried the urgency of someone trying to survive. She moved next to the well, pulling the rope with both hands, her tiny muscles tightening as she struggled to lift a bucket almost as heavy as herself. The rope burned against her palms, leaving thin red lines that blended with older marks, quiet reminders of days that looked exactly like this. A gust of wind brushed her face, but it brought no relief. She steadied herself, trying again, her knees wobbling each time the bucket jerked upward. Her breaths sounded like whispered apologies to the world, as though she owed it something simply for existing in it. By midday, she was carrying firewood again, pieces larger than her own torso. She wrapped her arms around the bundle, pressing it to her chest as splinters pricked her skin. The weight pushed her forward, almost dragging her to the ground, but she steadied herself with a determined silence. Her feet shuffled across the sand, leaving faint trails behind her like evidence of a child walking through a life far too heavy for her bones. A neighbor glanced at her and looked away, assuming this was normal, because cruelty becomes invisible when repeated often enough. Back inside, she scrubbed the floors with a rag, pushing her small body across the cement like a machine trained to endure. Her fingers stung from earlier chores, and the rough floor tore at her knuckles each time she leaned too hard. The woman's footsteps echoed behind her, a steady reminder that she could not slow down. Every scrape of the rag felt like she was erasing herself a little more. She blinked back tears, not because of the pain but because she knew tears were forbidden too. Weakness provoked punishment. Silence was safer than sorrow. In the kitchen, steam filled the air as she stirred a pot taller than her waist. Sweat dripped down her face, mingling with the heat rising from the fire. She stood barefoot on the cold tiles, her toes curling from the sting of the ground while the flames licked at her ankles. A sudden pop from the oil splattered her arm, but she didn't cry out. She simply swallowed the sharp pain, pressing her lips together like a child who had learned that suffering should not make noise. Her eyes were dull but disciplined, trained to obey, never to ask why. When the chores finally paused, she sat behind the house, hugging her knees to her chest as her breathing steadied. Her fingers traced patterns in the dirt, not drawings, just motions to remind herself she was still here, still human. She looked at her palms, bruised and blistered, then quickly hid them as though ashamed of the marks her life had written on her skin. The world around her was alive with laughter, music, and distant chatter, but she sat in silence, separated from joy as if by an invisible barrier. Hope flickered inside her, but fear smothered it quickly. As she rose to continue another task, her vision blurred for a moment from exhaustion. The ground tilted slightly, her knees buckling under the weight of too many burdens for a child her age. She steadied herself, drawing in a shallow breath as the woman's silhouette appeared in the doorway again, watchful, demanding, merciless. And as the girl braced for another command, she had no idea that someone outside was witnessing each moment, storing every detail, and preparing to question everything the village believed. Her suffering had been hidden for years, but the truth was no longer sleeping. The man stepped farther into the village that morning, his shoes brushing against red earth that felt strangely familiar. He carried a worn leather bag slung across his shoulder, and inside it were the remnants of a life he'd been chasing for years, a faded photograph, a child's broken bracelet, and a letter he'd read so many times the ink had begun to blur. His heartbeat quickened with every step as he scanned the compound, searching for something he couldn't name but deeply hoped to find. Something tugged at him, urging him forward, telling him he was closer than ever before. He had traveled across towns and faraway cities, following rumors that shattered as soon as he touched them. People pointed him in different directions, some out of pity, others out of profit. He visited orphanages, hospitals, homes where children whispered stories of missing parents. Each wrong lead carved new scars into his heart, but he pressed on because stopping meant accepting a loss too unbearable to hold. His nights were restless, filled with memories of the woman he once loved and the child he never got the chance to protect. He refused to believe they were truly gone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly like, comment, and tell us where you are watching from. As he approached the compound, a strange stillness wrapped around him. He paused, sensing something fragile in the air, something that felt like a memory brushing against his skin. The photograph in his bag seemed to grow heavier, pulling his thoughts backward, toward a small birthmark he used to kiss, toward a pair of bright eyes that mirrored his own. Pain tightened his throat as grief threatened to swallow him. But hope, stubborn and quiet, rose just enough to push him forward. He felt that if the truth lived anywhere, it lived here. And fate had finally brought him close. The villagers watched him from a distance, whispering among themselves. They recognized him, not by name, but by the aura of a man searching for something precious. His shoulders carried the weight of unanswered questions, and his eyes carried a sharpness that belonged to someone who refused to give up. Some murmured sympathy, others avoided him, sensing old troubles could awaken with his arrival. But he did not notice their glances. He was too focused on the small details, the open gate, the sound of movement behind the house, the faint, uneven footsteps of a child who seemed overworked. Reaching the center of the compound, he stopped when he heard the soft scraping of a bucket across the floor. He turned and saw a small figure dragging laundry with weakened, trembling arms. Something inside him cracked open. There was something about her posture, her fragility, the unspoken sadness surrounding her like a cold fog. He watched her lower her head, as if life had taught her she wasn't allowed to look at anyone directly. His heart squeezed painfully. Something in her presence felt familiar, achingly familiar. But he couldn't trust it yet. Hope had betrayed him too many times. His mind returned to the last night he had seen her mother, frail, terrified, clutching the newborn child to her chest. She had whispered truths that shook him, truths about threats, about secrets, about a world trying to erase their daughter before she could even take her first steps. He had sworn to find them both. But life tore that promise apart when tragedy struck. He had searched for years, guided by guilt, love, and a determination that refused to fade. And now, looking at this small girl moving like a shadow, he felt the past reaching out to him. Still hidden behind the hibiscus shrubs, he watched her struggle with a task too heavy for her small frame. A quiet storm began building in his chest, anger, sorrow, and an overwhelming need to protect. He took a step forward, then hesitated, afraid that getting too close might shatter the fragile moment of recognition forming in his mind. He wasn't sure yet, but something deep within him whispered that he had found what he'd been searching for. That this child, this overworked, voiceless girl, might be the one piece of his heart the world had stolen. And if that was true, everything was about to change. The girl lifted her head for just a moment, brushing a loose curl from her forehead, and the movement struck him like lightning. Her eyes, soft, uncertain, but impossibly familiar, caught a ray of morning light, and something inside him fractured. He froze, unable to look away, as a memory he had buried beneath years of heartbreak rose sharply to the surface. Those eyes belonged to another time, another life, to someone whose absence had carved a permanent ache into his soul. His breath hitched, refusing to move, as the world around him blurred into insignificance. Recognition was pulling at him violently. He stepped closer without realizing it, drawn forward by a force he couldn't resist. The girl shifted again, wiping sweat from her brow, revealing the left side of her neck where a small, crescent-shaped birthmark rested like a secret carved into her skin. His heart slammed against his ribs. That birthmark, rare, delicate, unmistakable, was the same one he used to trace gently with his fingertip when she was a newborn. His vision trembled as truth and disbelief collided inside him. He blinked hard, wondering if grief had finally begun to deceive his senses. But grief doesn't invent birthmarks. His knees weakened as a surge of emotions swept through him. Memories flooded in, tiny hands gripping his thumb, soft cries in the night, the quiet joy of holding a future he had prayed for. Then the terror of losing them both too soon, the helplessness of searching for a child the world insisted no longer existed. Standing there, watching her struggle with work meant for grown bodies, he felt something break open inside him. Hope, raw and trembling, clawing its way back to life. If he was right, this was not just any child. This was his child, his daughter. But fear seized him just as quickly. What if he was wrong? What if the birthmark was a coincidence, the eyes a trick of light, the familiarity nothing more than desperation twisting his perception? He took another step closer, watching her tuck a loose strand behind her ear in a gesture identical to her mother's. His breath caught again. The gentle tilt of her head, the quiet way she moved, even the small frown she made when focusing, they all belonged to a child whose existence had defined him once. Uncertainty battled with certainty, and the tension nearly crushed him. The girl suddenly winced, shifting the weight of a basin she was lifting. Her expression tightened with pain, and he instinctively reached out a hand, stopping himself mid-motion. She didn't see him. She was too focused on surviving another task. As she turned slightly, a faint, thin scar across her shoulder came into view, the same shoulder her mother shielded on that terrifying night years ago. His heart trembled violently. Too many signs. Too many memories. Too many echoes of a past that refused to stay buried. The world seemed to tilt as the truth grew impossible to deny. The woman appeared again, barking a silent command through narrowed eyes. The girl straightened instantly, her small body tightening like a soldier under inspection. The man felt his stomach twist with rage and disbelief. His daughter, if she truly was his daughter, was living like a servant in a house that paraded kindness to the world. As the woman turned away, the girl instinctively stepped back, shrinking into herself, and the man saw fear in her posture that shattered him. No child should move like that. No child with his blood should know fear like that. The girl bent to lift another heavy bucket, and in that moment, her face turned fully toward him. Unguarded, exposed, heartbreakingly familiar. His breath left him completely. There she was. The child he had searched for. The child he had mourned. The child fate had stolen from his arms. His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes, not from weakness, but from a truth too powerful to contain. Everything inside him screamed that this was her, his daughter. And as the realization sank into his bones, he understood one terrifying thing. The woman who claimed to care for her had been hiding far more than cruelty. The woman paced through her kitchen with a tightness in her jaw that revealed more than she intended. She sensed something shifting in the air, something she could not control, and it made her movement sharper, quicker, less composed. She had spent years constructing a perfect narrative, a story in which she was the savior, the guardian, the generous woman who took in a helpless child. But beneath that carefully built world lived a truth she had buried so deep that even she sometimes pretended it didn't exist. And now, with a stranger's presence lingering near her gate, the soil felt dangerously loose. She paused at the window, watching the girl struggle with a bucket far too heavy for her. A flicker of something cold crossed her eyes. Not guilt, not concern, but fear disguised as irritation. She remembered the day the child first arrived at her doorstep, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't hers, accompanied by rumors she pretended not to care about. She had seen an opportunity then, a child with no name, no history, no family to question her authority. A child she could mold, control, silence. A child whose existence could benefit her far more than anyone realized. The truth was simple and ugly. The girl was never meant to be loved in this house. She was meant to be useful. The woman's envy had grown roots the day she recognized beauty in her small, fragile features, beauty that threatened her own fading relevance in the village. The child's soft eyes drew sympathy she couldn't command, and every compliment the villagers gave the girl stabbed her pride like a thorn. She told herself she was strict for the child's sake, for discipline, for training. But deep down, she feared the girl would one day outshine her in the only place she felt powerful. To protect her pride, she crafted lies with the precision of a storyteller. She whispered to neighbors about the girl's supposed attitude, her slowness, her stubbornness. She planted seeds of doubt so delicately that people repeated her words without realizing the manipulation. Over time, her lies became accepted truth. The village saw her as a patient woman caring for a burdensome child, and she used that sympathy to fortify her image. It became a shield, one she clung to desperately each time the girl's quiet strength threatened to expose the cracks beneath her perfection. Yet the secret she feared most wasn't about cruelty, it was about identity. She remembered the night she overheard whispers about a missing baby, an heir from a family with influence, lineage, legacy. She remembered seeing that same birthmark on the child's neck and realizing that the girl she had taken in might belong to a world far above her own. Instead of reporting it, she buried the truth beneath her pride. Raising a lost heir meant losing control. Losing control meant losing the fragile power she built her life around. So she hid the birthmark. She hid the origins. She hid the girl. And now, seeing the man in her compound earlier, the way he froze at the sight of the child, terror clawed at her ribs. She recognized the look in his eyes. Recognition. Possession. A father's ache. She knew instantly who he was, even if years had changed his face. More importantly, she knew what he was capable of reclaiming. Everything she built, her reputation, her influence, her sense of superiority, could crumble in a single breath if the truth slipped out. Her mask, polished for years, felt suddenly heavy, almost suffocating. And for the first time, she saw the possibility of ruin. She stepped outside again, her expression stiff, her breath shallow. The girl flinched instinctively, as if sensing a storm gathering behind the woman's eyes. But the woman wasn't looking at the child this time. She was scanning the edges of the compound, searching for the man who had witnessed too much. Her secrets were no longer safe. Her lies were no longer solid. Her world was cracking along the seams she thought would hold forever. And as the morning sun blazed mercilessly across the compound, she realized with chilling clarity that fate had come to collect its debt. Morning drifted into noon, and the village rhythm thickened with whispers. It began with a market woman who spotted the man leaving the compound, his expression strained with something deeper than travel fatigue. She murmured to her neighbor, who murmured to another, until the story spread like smoke over dry grass. People who once praised the woman now paused in confusion, sensing a crack in the image they had admired for so long. They watched her doorway with widened eyes, curious and unsettled. The village didn't know what had happened yet, but they knew something had shifted, something dangerous and true. By afternoon, 2 elders sat beneath the mango tree discussing the stranger's visit. They recalled rumors from years ago, a frantic search, a family torn apart, a child whispered to be missing. Their voices dropped to low tones as they connected threads they had long forgotten. The birthmark, the timeline, the child's mysterious arrival. Suspicion seeped into their words like ink into cloth. If the stranger came looking for someone, and that someone lived in the woman's house, then the village had unknowingly stood on the edge of a secret that would not stay silent much longer. Meanwhile, the girl continued her chores in the compound, unaware of the swelling storm beyond the walls. But the villagers' eyes followed her every move now, her quietness, her trembling hands, the way she avoided looking up. They noticed things they had previously ignored, the scars on her arms, the thinness of her wrists, the exhaustion pulling her small shoulders downward. Suddenly, pity replaced admiration. Judgment replaced trust. The village began to question what else the woman had hidden behind her well-crafted mask, and with each new suspicion, their loyalty loosened. The woman sensed the shift immediately. When she stepped outside to fetch water, the neighbors who once greeted her warmly now offered tight smiles or none at all. Conversations that used to pause in admiration now paused in fear of confrontation. She felt eyes trailing her, felt the tension in the air thickening with unspoken accusation. She tried to stand tall, wearing her usual pleasant facade, but even she couldn't ignore the tremor creeping into her fingers. She had worked so hard to control the story, but now the story was slipping out of her grasp. As dusk approached, the man returned with 2 elders by his side. Their arrival shattered whatever illusion remained. The woman's breath caught when she saw them, knowing elders didn't intervene unless truth demanded an audience. They stood in her compound with solemn expressions, their eyes moving past her toward the girl who had paused mid-task. The girl's small chest rose and fell with fear, sensing that something monumental was unfolding around her. The woman attempted a smile, a greeting, a lie, but her voice cracked, betraying her before she could even speak. The elders asked to see the girl more closely. The woman refused at first, her voice tight with panic, but the elders insisted with authority she could not challenge. Slowly, the girl stepped forward, avoiding eye contact. The man knelt, trembling, and gently lifted her chin so he could see her face in full light. Gasps rippled through the villagers who had gathered at the gate. Her eyes, her expression, and the birthmark now visible beneath her braided hair. The truth crashed into the courtyard with breathtaking force. The child was not an orphan. She was someone's stolen past. Whispers erupted instantly, sharp, rising, unstoppable. The villagers looked at the woman with disbelief, anger, betrayal. They recalled every moment they praised her, every time they defended her, every lie she told with ease. Suddenly, her generosity turned into manipulation. Her discipline became cruelty. Her kindness disintegrated into deception. She felt their judgment pressing against her like a tightening noose, and for the first time, she understood the weight of her actions. The secret she buried had risen from the ground, she tried to suffocate it beneath, and now the entire village stood witness to her unraveling. The compound fell into a breathless silence as the elders motioned for the girl to step forward. She hesitated, her thin legs trembling beneath her, unsure why so many eyes were suddenly fixed on her small frame. The man knelt again, this time slower, steadier, as if the truth resting in front of him was too sacred to rush. His fingers hovered near her cheek, but he didn't touch her. He simply studied her face with the intensity of someone staring at a long-lost memory. The girl swallowed hard, sensing something monumental was unfolding, though she didn't yet understand what. A gentle wind swept through the compound, lifting the edge of her braided hair and revealing the birthmark completely. Gasps echoed around her, each one striking the woman like a blow. The man's entire body shook as tears pooled in his eyes, not from pain but from recognition. He whispered her name under his breath, her real name, the one she had never heard in this house. Though she didn't know the meaning behind the sound, something in her chest fluttered, as if her soul recognized a story her mind had forgotten. The villagers leaned in, witnessing rebirth. The elders exchanged grave looks as the man opened his leather bag, pulling out the worn photograph he had carried across towns and heartbreak. He held it beside the girl's face, a tiny infant wrapped in a cloth with the same crescent birthmark, the same eyes, the same quiet innocence. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The resemblance was undeniable, almost haunting in its clarity. The truth struck like lightning. The girl was not a stray child rescued by kindness. She was a daughter ripped from her lineage, lost to lies, and forced into a life of servitude she was never meant to endure. For the first time, the girl's posture shifted. She touched her own neck gently, tracing the birthmark as though discovering a part of herself she had overlooked her entire life. Then she looked at the photograph, studying the infant's face with wide, trembling eyes. A spark flickered inside her heart, fragile but bright. Could it be hers? Could she have once belonged to someone who cared enough to search for her all these years? Confusion warred with a strange blooming hope, and tears she never allowed herself to shed welled up and threatened to spill. The man began revealing pieces of the past to the elders. How her mother had died trying to protect her, how he had searched relentlessly, how rumors spiraled until all traces went cold. The villagers listened with growing shame, realizing they had enabled a lie simply because it was coated in charm. They remembered how the woman flaunted the story of saving an orphan, how they praised her without question, how they ignored the child's suffering. Guilt crept into their bones. They hadn't just failed the girl. They had helped bury the truth that could have saved her years earlier. Meanwhile, the woman crumbled into a corner of the compound, her knees weakening as the elders recounted her deception. She tried to speak, but the words collapsed on her tongue. Every justification she once clung to sounded hollow now. The village she manipulated for so long finally saw her clearly, not as a savior, but as a thief of destiny. She felt their condemnation sealing around her, stripping away the admiration she depended on like oxygen. Every tremor in her body echoed her fear, not just of consequences, but of a truth she could no longer rewrite. The girl stood quietly as the chaos swirled around her, but inside, something shifted, something profound and aching. She looked at the man again, and this time, she didn't look away. His tears, his trembling smile, the softness in his eyes. None of it matched the harshness she had known. It felt unfamiliar, frightening, and strangely comforting. For the first time, she wondered what it might feel like to belong to someone. To be held instead of ordered. To be loved instead of used. The truth had finally found her, and though she didn't fully understand it, her heart whispered one thing: she was never meant to suffer. The woman's world began collapsing the moment the elders stepped toward her with that heavy, deliberate silence that only arrives when truth demands justice. She tried to stand tall, but her legs felt like soaked cloth beneath her. The villagers who once praised her now stepped back, forming a ring around her, not out of respect, but out of condemnation. Every whisper pierced her pride like a thorn. Every stare stripped away another layer of her carefully constructed image. She reached for the mask she always wore, but it had cracked beyond repair. And Karma, patient and steady, finally stepped inside. A trembling apology formed on her lips, but the elders raised their hands, silencing her. They had heard enough of her stories, enough of her pretended goodness, enough of the lies she fed the village for years. The girl's scars, the stolen childhood, the hidden identity, all of it laid bare in the afternoon light. She felt the weight of every secret dragging her downward, every selfish choice echoing back at her. She tried to explain, to twist the truth in her favor, but for the first time, her words sounded small, desperate, and powerless. The truth no longer belonged to her. The villagers shifted their attention toward the girl, no longer with pity, but with outrage on her behalf. They remembered every moment they ignored her suffering, every time they dismissed her trembling hands as laziness, every time they looked away. Their guilt sharpened into anger, and that anger turned toward the woman who orchestrated it all. She felt their disappointment pressing into her bones. She tried to speak of sacrifice, of providing shelter, of feeding the girl, but her excuses dissolved under the weight of reality. Shelter without love is captivity. Food without kindness is punishment. And everyone knew it now. The elders delivered their verdict in solemn tones. The girl would leave the compound immediately. Her guardianship was revoked. The woman was forbidden to go near her again. Her reputation, once the envy of neighbors, crumbled into dust beneath her feet. She felt her knees weaken as the villagers turned away one by one, denying her the attention she once lived for. The silence they left behind stung more deeply than any insult. Reputation had been her currency, her comfort, her shield. And now she was bankrupt. The power she clung to so fiercely had evaporated like smoke in sunlight. Inside her chest, panic swelled into something wild and choking. She reached for the girl, not out of love, but out of desperation to salvage control. But the elders stepped between them, blocking her path. The girl flinched, recoiling from the outstretched hand, and the villagers gasped. That single reaction revealed more truth than any testimony could. The woman withdrew her hand slowly, realizing too late that fear had replaced whatever affection she once pretended to offer. The girl's rejection spread through the crowd like a final verdict, undeniable, irreversible, devastating. And the woman felt the sting of losing more than a child. She had lost her audience. As the man, her father, gathered the girl gently into his arms, something inside the woman splintered. Not remorse, not empathy, but the shattering realization that the child she treated like property was actually the one thing she should have protected. A child destined for a life she tried to smother. An heir she tried to hide. An innocent whose suffering would now define her downfall. Her mouth quivered as she tried to form a plea, not for forgiveness, but for another chance to rewrite the story. But karma does not grant rewrites. It only returns what is owed. The woman collapsed onto the floor as the man led the girl away, surrounded by villagers who no longer saw a savior, but a betrayer. Her tears fell silently, carving tracks through the dust on her face. She wasn't crying for the child she never had. She was crying for herself, for the life she had built on lies, for the power slipping through her fingers, for the mask she could no longer wear. And as the girl disappeared down the path toward a new future, the woman understood the full force of karma. Everything she had done to the child had returned to her doorstep, twice as heavy, twice as sharp, and right on time. The man carried the girl out of the compound with a tenderness that seemed almost foreign to her. His arms wrapped around her lightly, as though afraid she might break under even the gentlest touch. She didn't resist. She simply lay still, stiff with uncertainty, trying to understand why her body felt so safe in the arms of a stranger. As they moved through the village, the world around her blurred into colors and shapes she couldn't focus on. All she could feel was the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek, a sound oddly familiar, strangely comforting. He led her to the shade of an old Udala tree and knelt on the earth with her. For a long moment he didn't speak. He simply looked at her. Really looked at her, with eyes full of years she never lived beside him. Tears slipped silently down his cheeks, falling onto the dusty ground, each one carrying a memory of the daughter he had imagined every day since losing her. The girl watched him carefully, confused by the raw emotion on a grown man's face. No one had ever cried for her before. No one had ever held her like she mattered. A soft breeze brushed her face as he opened his leather bag again, pulling out the baby bracelet she did not remember. The beads were chipped from time, but when he placed it gently in her palm, something stirred inside her, a faint whisper of recognition, like a dream half forgotten. Her small fingers curled around it instinctively. The man's breath trembled as he watched her reaction, as though that motion alone confirmed what his heart already knew. She looked up at him, eyes questioning, and something deep in her chest gave a small, cautious flutter. Could she truly belong to someone? He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to step away, but she didn't. His hand brushed her cheek in a tender motion that held years of longing. The girl's eyes widened at the softness of it. She wasn't used to gentle hands. She wasn't used to being touched without demand or punishment. A lump formed in her throat, tight and unfamiliar, as she leaned forward by instinct alone. Her forehead pressed lightly against his shoulder, and the man's entire body shuddered under the weight of the moment. It felt like the world was knitting itself back together at the seams. Nearby villagers pretended not to watch, but their hearts softened as they witnessed fragments of a family coming back into alignment. Mothers wiped their eyes discreetly. Elders nodded slowly, as if witnessing a prophecy fulfilled. The girl felt the shift too, an unspoken warmth settling around her, a feeling she couldn't name but didn't dare let go of. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. She felt claimed. And the man, holding her as though cradling a miracle, whispered truths without words, promises that the suffering she endured would never touch her again. He lifted her gently to her feet, brushing dirt from her skirt like a father who had done it 1,000 times. The girl looked down at her palms, once instruments of labor, now held with reverence, and found herself trembling. Not from fear, but from possibility. The man extended his hand toward her, waiting. Not demanding, not commanding. Waiting. She stared at it for a moment, her breath caught between past and future. Then, slowly, she placed her small hand in his. It fit. Perfectly. As though the universe had been holding its breath for this touch. As they began walking together toward the edge of the village, she felt something growing beside her, small, fragile, but real. A beginning. With every step, the weight she had carried for years slipped away like dust shaken from tired feet. The man wiped his eyes again, overwhelmed by the miracle of holding what he once feared lost forever. And the girl, glancing up at him under the fading light, realized something she never believed possible. She was not alone. Not anymore. Her life, her real life, was finally beginning. And she was walking into it hand in hand with her father. The village softened into evening as father and daughter approached the old path leading out of the compound. The air was warm, tinted with gold, as if the sky itself wished to bless their reunion. The girl walked quietly beside him, her steps uncertain at first, then gradually steadying as her trust grew. Each moment felt surreal, like waking from a nightmare into a dream she wasn't sure she deserved. The man glanced down at her repeatedly, unable to stop himself, as though confirming she was truly there. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Heaven had already begun its healing. As they reached the edge of the village, an elder approached with a soft smile, carrying a small woven bag. Inside it were simple gifts: soap, new slippers, dried fruit, things the villagers gathered unintentionally to show remorse for their silence. The girl blinked in surprise and used to kindness, without condition. The elder placed a hand gently over her small shoulder, murmuring a blessing for a future unmarred by the shadows of her past. She didn't understand every word, but she understood the warmth in his eyes. For the first time, the world didn't feel like an enemy. They continued toward the man's modest home in the neighboring town, guided by the soft glow of lanterns beginning to flicker awake. The girl walked with the bracelet clutched to her chest, feeling it pulse with memories she didn't have but somehow knew belonged to her. The man held her hand the entire journey, each step sealing the bond that life had tried so hard to break. He felt her small fingers tighten around his, not in fear but in an instinctive seeking of comfort. And with each tightening, a piece of his long-broken heart returned to him. When they reached his house, a quiet, gentle space filled with the faint scent of the mother she never knew, the girl stepped inside hesitantly. The man lifted a photograph from the shelf and knelt beside her, letting her hold it. The woman in the picture smiled warmly, her features tender and familiar. The girl traced the outline of the photo with trembling fingers. She didn't recognize the face, but something inside her recognized the feeling. The man watched her carefully, his eyes softening as he realized the truth. Some memories return not through the mind, but through the soul. He prepared a small meal for her, setting the plate in front of her with quiet reverence. She stared at it, confused, as though waiting for permission or punishment. When he nodded gently, she took a bite and paused. It was the first meal she had eaten without fear in years. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breath deepened. And for the first time, she allowed herself to taste not just food but freedom. The man watched her eat, tears silently slipping down his cheeks, grateful for the simple miracle of seeing his daughter nourished, safe, and unburdened. Later that night, as she settled onto a soft mattress, still unfamiliar, still almost too comfortable for her to trust, she curled up beneath the blanket the man tucked around her. Outside, the night hummed peacefully, carrying the sounds of crickets and distant laughter from families ending their day. The girl stared at the ceiling, no longer counting cracks to escape her reality, but letting her mind explore a future she didn't know she could have. For the first time in her life, she didn't fall asleep from exhaustion. She fell asleep from safety. And as dawn approached, a gentle light filtered into the room, touching her face like a blessing. The man stood in the doorway, watching her breathe softly, marveling at the quiet miracle of having his child home again. She no longer looked like the shadow he found in that cruel compound. She looked like a beginning, a promise, a story restored. Heaven had returned what was stolen, not through lightning or thunder, but through truth finally rising and love refusing to